All right, so I want to start today with a little bit of a comment about lighting, which I don't normally do on this channel, but this is something that I go over quite a bit with students and at my workshops and whatnot. And the basic premise is if you are lighting for or have, situational lighting that has deeper shadows. In this case, I lit for deeper shadows. See this? All these beautiful dark shadows. The way she posed at this angle created some interesting shadow shapes, and they're pretty deep, and we have nearly pure black in a lot of places, right? If you have that, or if you tried for that, do not try to undo that in post. Do not do that in the edit. If you shot for deep shadows, there's a reason why you shot for deep shadows. And if there isn't, because you just kind of, messed up or didn't quite achieve your vision, it's never going to really work right to try to completely remove the shadows. The light shaping is there. You're not going to fake it back to soft, smooth light. Enjoy your dark shadows. And like I said, most of the time when I teach a class, I will show a very deep dark shadow kind of look and say, hey, let's embrace those shadows. Even if the back of the camera, if you're shooting, of course, digital, the LCD could show super dark shadows and you panic and you think you've messed up. Don't. Deep shadows can be good. And these are pretty tame compared to the deep shadows that I like to work with. However, if you've ever taken a retouching course with me, then you know that something that I like to do is what I call peering into the shadows. And what I mean by that is I'll take some sort of method to brighten very subtly, brighten certain areas of deep shadow, because there's usually data in there, especially if you're working in RAW, ideally. But if you're working in 16-bit in Photoshop, then still, there's a lot of data in there. However, bringing it back to where you're trying to pretend the shadow isn't there is a mistake, in my opinion. But I like to peer into the shadows. Now, one method that I use is I take a curves layer. It can be a lot of other layers, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And I pull up this bottom left point right here on the curve. And all that does is make it like a haze. It brings it up linearly, right? So it's like a haze. On top of that, on the curves layer, I have the mask inverted because I'm going to paint into it. And I've got blend if in this setup down here, which I will explain also shortly. Then I take a brush, nice soft white brush, 100% everything. And then I'll be like, let's peer into the shadows right over here. I've lost some data right here on her right eye. Click. You see that little bit of a peer into the shadow? Small brush there, little bit in there, maybe down here by the cheek. What's happening in the cheek? Okay, that one's probably a little bit too, it needs to be a little bigger. Since I have blend if protecting the shadows somewhat, I can just kind of click there. I don't like that one very much. I'm going to make two small ones there and there. I think that works okay. Maybe right under the hand, I want to see that, oh, there's some information in there. Maybe a little bit of texture there. Who knows where you want to do it, but you peer into the shadows and then you scale back your opacity. This is a very subtle effect. So there's like a 55%. You know what? Let's go to 60 for the video. Off and on. Let's go ahead and zoom in so you can see. Off and on, off and on. I want to go less, so I'm going to go like 45%. See, it goes from deep shadows, which is fine. And by peering into the shadows, it adds a little more depth to your image without trying to pretend that you can get rid of the shadows, right? So suddenly she has more face shape. You see more detail to the right of her eye here on the side of her head, right? Instead of pure black, you have some detail. Now, this is not just a matter of process. Like if you have deep shadows, you must do this. No. But every now and then, when you don't want just pure black or nearly black, pure shadows, that little peer into the shadows is a great method. However, when I go over this process with different students, they ask me, well, what if I don't want to use curves? Or I don't normally use curves this way? Or is curves the only way? And the answer to all of that is, it depends. So let's close this one out. We're going to do a demo here of the same image, okay? But I've set up a demo, and this is only a demo. You'll never need to run a layer stack like this, not really. Okay, so what I've done is I've just taken 5 different adjustment layers, and currently, just to show for demo, I have them on a luminosity mask of that group, of that layer group, favoring the shadows, as you can see here. We can rebuild that if we need to, but because it's a raster mask or a pixel mask, it is permanent. And I have all these different adjustment layers underneath, and we're going to show how quote-unquote brightening something in Photoshop can vary quite a bit. So right now, it's just a straight mask of all the relatively deep shadows. I like more flexibility than that. That's why I use blend if when I do it proper. But here is a good demo. So here's curves. We have exposure. We have brightness and contrast. levels, of course, and the hue and saturation is here because it has a lightness slider. And I want to show everybody the different ways that we can brighten things and why you may use a different way versus another one, okay? So most of the time, we're going to tell you, I say we, meaning Photoshop nerds and retouching educators, we're going to tell you, if you want to brighten or darken, start with curves. And one of the reasons why is because you can do the curve, right? So for example, everything's ready here, got the shadows on the luminosity mask. If I click the middle of the curve, standard issue brightening or darkening, we pull up to the left, we get a brightening effect again on a curve. And because of that, we're effectively preserving contrast. So a little bit of the brightness is preserved because it does not brighten or darken it. And a little bit of the deepest shadow is preserved because it does not brighten or darken it. So we get off, on, off, on. So it still has that sort of contrasting kind of vibe to it, but everything is brighter. I wouldn't necessarily want to do this to this shot, but it's a good start to maybe scale back the opacity. And now I've added a little bit of depth into the shadows where I didn't have it before. I don't want to overcompensate. I don't want to pretend that I can bring all those shadows back. It doesn't really work. But you see, working on a curve, we can create that kind of contrast preserving boost, whether it's lightening or darkening. And not to mention, of course, because it's curved, we can also do detail work. So we can put a point in the middle and just bring up the low end. We're actually bringing down the high end in this case, but the point is you're working with curves, so you can sort of target luminosity ranges with curves. Not to mention anything else that a curve can do. You can, of course, do it here. And just kind of reiterate, the bottom left node, if I bring it up, it's a very linear type of softening, right? So because of that, curves are very flexible. You can do quite a bit with them. You can even take this linear point down and darken in a linear manner, okay? All kinds of different things. Curves is probably going to solve most of your desire to brighten and darken in some manner. Curves have different options. Now, in some cases, exposure works well. And exposure is not the easiest thing to understand because we have these offset and gamma correction sliders. Now, the technical science behind all of these things, I'm not even 100% certain on. I just know how the kind of result that they tend to get you. So first of all, you have exposure. So let's say you put 1 + 1 exposure. That usually works pretty well. And in this case, we're doing similar to the curves by creating a brightening effect on the shadow area that's a little bit contrast preserving, okay? But if we do, like, for example, 2, right, it starts to get a little less contrast preserving. We're getting a little bit of a weird feel here where some of our transitions are a little bit too modified. And that's where the offset can come in to help either soften or increase the intensity, right? Very, very subtle. That's why they have up to 4 digits here. It can be very, very subtle. And of course, gamma correction, if you play with that, you can kind of go back and forth and up and down. The calculations of exposure usually confuse people. They kind of confuse me. I tend to use exposure not so much on portraits because I feel like there's a lot of I don't know. I don't like the way the transitions end up being most of the time. But if I have a situation where I really need to recover a specific area of an image, not always on a person, in fact, usually not, I find that this gives me a little bit of granular control over how I want the contrast to appear when I'm brightening or darkening a certain area. So exposure is simply another way to brighten and darken, okay? On top of that, we have the famous brightness and contrast. This is very old. It's been around for a long, long time. Speaking of, there's a use legacy button here, which is I forget what version it is, but it's a quite old version of Photoshop that can be used. It mostly affects the contrast, but nonetheless, if you brighten, you see we get a nice pleasing brightening effect. Okay. And then of course you can reduce the contrast to soften that if you want ever so slightly. This is extremely subtle. Okay. Or you can increase the contrast as well while brightening. Again, we create an interesting transition that may not be appealing, but nonetheless, you have that control to brighten up the shadows in a different sort of way, right? By the way, all of these are set to luminosity blend mode, except the hue and saturation one, to minimize color shifting. Now, levels, of course, everything levels can do, curves can do, but levels can do something, levels has a different way of viewing it. Like, for example, if I know I really want to brighten a shadowy area, but really preserve strong contrast, I can pull the right node in to a limit. There's a limit on everything, but I can pull the right node in because I'm brightening, being masked by the luminosity mask, the shadows are being protected or rather focused on. I can brighten it in a way that really preserves strong contrast. See that? And again, on a linear manner, I can take this middle node and increase contrast. I can decrease contrast, etc. Now, at any moment, any of these, let's say it was blend if, I could invert it and then take my white paintbrush and do the peering into the shadows technique. See that? And now I've done that. I kind of give a little bit of shadow view there, maybe a little less opacity. And again, going into the shadows. That sort of subtlety in retouching, I think, is similar to the subtlety in lighting. I think that over time, we start realizing that shotgun blasting everything doesn't really work. So if you want like a highlight rim light or reflector to fill in the shadowy side of a portrait, subtle often wins the day, as opposed to everything being really obvious. Okay, it exists, therefore it's right. And that is, in my opinion, a mistake, right? So subtlety is important. Here again, we can also take in the left node here on the output levels, and we can just simply soften in a linear manner. Okay, let me just actually hold up a second. Let me soften it some more. And then we can invert that mask again, just to replicate what it would be like if we had a blend diff, which I recommend because you can change the actual luminosity range. Click there, click there, click there, and then maybe like a 40% opacity. And again, we're peering into the shadows ever so slightly, 35% opacity actually, ever so slightly to get some depth into the shadows without trying to recover them in a false manner. So let's put that to 100%, and we're going to reset that one. Now, hue and saturation is mostly here to show you that the lightness slider works in a linear manner as well for that softening effect, right? So you can soften all of it. It's still going to preserve a little bit of detail. For example, actually, whether you use the lightness or you use levels output or you use the curves node on the bottom left, if you do something like from here to 5, that could be enough, for example, to scale back the depth of the shadows if you're going to print and you tend to have high contrasty prints for some reason. If you do that, bring up in a linear manner, bring up just the shadows. That could help you have your shadowy images not look quite as, if they are being a problem, it helps them look not quite as clumpy in the shadows just by bringing it up in a linear manner. There's so many different ways or reasons why you might want to do or care about any of this. So again, this is just a demo of 5 different ones, 5 different potential ways you might want to, quote, brighten. And then, of course, just as a reminder, I have it all masked out in a permanent way with a raster mask, with a pixel mask. But just to give you an idea of what it's like when you have a shot that has deep shadows, what can you do with it, right? Masking is going to be important, okay? Whether it's a absolute raster-based luminosity mask or you're using blend diff, it's a good idea to make sure your transitions are nice and smooth. You don't want to brighten on her cheek when you want to brighten the shadow next to her. So some method of targeting the luminosity is important, but we can brighten so many different ways. We got the multiple ways that curves can do it. Again, they'll do most everything you need. Exposure, if you want to play around with that, if you have some really nuanced ways of processing the texture and the contrast, right? Brightness and contrast, again, a little more direct, a little more straightforward. Sometimes it gets you the exact look that you want, just a different way it calculates it. Levels is a slightly more limited curves, but here again, it has just a different interface, so you kind of see things a little more directly. I like it. I use it all the time. And then, of course, hue and saturation for the lightness slider as another linear way of brightening. I recommend you play with all of them, even if you don't do a setup like this, even if you don't have deep shadows to bring back. Play with all of this kind of stuff. Brightening something in Photoshop and, of course, darkening something is not just a one-way thing. There's so many different ways to go about it, and it depends on the situation. But as a final point, again, I'll remind you, if you shoot for deep shadows, okay, the shot is like, you know what? I want some drama. I want those shadows. Embrace them, love them, peer into them if you need to in post-production, but don't try to recover them. It just doesn't work. If you're like, I didn't want these shadows, I'm going to do everything in my power to bring them back because I did not want them. There you go. That looks good. Unfortunately, guys, you do this long enough, and I've been teaching retouching for 15 years. When you see this look, you know exactly what it is. This is someone who shot deep shadows and they tried to recover them. Just don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Enjoy your deep shadows. They can be a real creative element and a powerful element in your portraits.